Happy Wednesday, everyone. New day, new format. I know that the one day that it's going to come that I just decide I've had it and I'm not going to try any new technology. But after my first video, I thought there's got to be something better than this. And so I'm trying out a new format. It's called Prezi Video. Prezi Video allows me to upload slides while you can also see my face. And I think that that is helpful because in teaching, we're always trying to create a connection, a communication. And so moving forward, if this format works out, you're going to see a lot more like this, where you get both my face and the slides and my voice all in one. I will say I'm going to be zooming in on a number of slides, and today's going to be really textual as we talk more about Socrates. But I will also upload the traditional PDF to Blackboard. So if you want to pull up that PowerPoint slide and follow along in addition to this video, that's just fine with me too. Move at your own pace, take your time, maybe break this lecture up into chunks. Like I said, the human brain, I think, at least these days, is pretty good at processing information up to about the 15-point mark. So let's get started. Last video that I created was all about Aristophanes' impact on the trial of Socrates, this play that he wrote about 25 years before the trial, and how that might have shaped the perception of jurors in ancient Athens as they thought about who Socrates was and what Socrates taught. In today's video, we're going to move on to new evidence coming almost entirely from Plato about what evidence there might be that Socrates did in fact challenge the gods. So for today, we're looking at the charges against Socrates, part 2. And my goal here is really to try to provide you a fair bit of evidence that you might be able to use in your papers without biasing you in one direction or another. That's the nice thing about history, is that we're all working from the same sources, but we can come up with very different interpretations. In terms of today's big takeaway, let me go ahead and zoom in on this. As we look at Plato, we're going to find that there is in fact some evidence that Socrates was challenging traditional state religion. And what I mean by that is mythology, the notion of the gods, the notion of whether your religious beliefs on a personal level should supersede the religious sentiments of your city. And because of this, I'm going to argue at the end of my video today, Socrates' little challenges to traditional religion mean that he gets lumped in with a number of other sophists who are also challenging on a big scale the role that religion should play in the life of a true philosopher or pursuer of wisdom, as it were. So, like I said, today's going to be a lot of close reading. We're going to look a lot at Plato's texts, and I'm going to try to show you the ways you could make arguments for and against Socrates on the basis of those texts. All right, so let's dive in a little bit more, and let me give you a refresher what we talked about last time. So last video, I emphasized that Socrates was charged with 2 accusations. The first was impiety, that Socrates refuses to recognize the gods recognized by the state, and that he introduces other new deities, according to that Roman author Diogenes Laertius. And the second, of course, is that Socrates has corrupted the youth, which seems naturally very vague, but also makes sense if you think about Socrates' impact on a large population of Athenian young men. So just to recap, again, we talked about the Aristophanes clouds as the last video. If you haven't seen that, go back and watch that one first. But today we're going to zoom into the other 2 bubbles a little bit more closely, the dialogues of Socrates written by Plato, and also the evidence we have about the reputation of other famous sophists in Athens like Gorgias and Prodicus. If you haven't ever heard the word sophist before, don't worry too much. We're going to define that term a bit more clearly and emphasize why they were so popular and notorious in Athens at the same time. Now, before we venture into the texts of Plato specifically, I want to give us a couple of caveats. You'll remember from maybe the last time we met that when we talked about Plato, I emphasized that kind of like Jesus, Socrates never writes anything himself. So that means that we have to take his testimony written down by others with a big grain of salt. We have to recognize that everything we think we know about Socrates is coming through the lens of other people. It's a little bit like Heaven forbid I should get hit by a bus tomorrow, and the only thing that the world knew about my teaching is if they looked at your notes. You can imagine that there would probably be a pretty big gap between what the student retains and what the teacher actually taught. So we never really know the historical Socrates. We know the Socrates as represented by other people. And of course, in the case of Aristophanes, we saw that that representation was of kind of a strange little fuddy-duddy who floated around in a basket and talked about the clouds as gods. But moving forward with Plato, I just want to bring to your attention a couple of caveats that we need to know moving forward. And this will especially be important if you decide if you want to write your second speech paper about Socrates. If you're going to write it as a traditional paper, you've always got to keep in mind these blind spots when it comes to using a Platonic text. Okay, so what are some of those caveats look like? The first one is to remember just how young Plato is at the time, both of the trial and at the time that he was working with Socrates. I reminded you, I think last class, that Socrates was already in his about 70 years old at the time of the trial. But Plato, and in fact most of Socrates' students, was much younger. We're not entirely sure of Plato's age. There's some evidence that he was born in the transition between 428, 427, or another possibility is 424. But what that means ultimately is that Socrates' students were, for the most part, between the ages of 25 and 30 at the time of his trial. Plato was quite young, not a teenager, but just having a few years of being a citizen under his belt. And youth, I hope you won't take offense at this, but youth feel things very deeply. I think you can relate to this in your own time. You're so young and we're all going through this coronavirus crisis. It might be the first major crisis you've had to kind of deal with on your own. And similarly for Plato, this was probably the first major crisis on a personal and political level that he'd ever dealt with as a young person. I sometimes joke with my sister, I know this is going to seem like a little tangent, but just stay with me. Sometimes I joke with my sister that the music you love in your adult life is very often the music that you listened to when you were between the ages of, say, 17 and 28. And I think that's because music is something you feel so deeply in your late teenage to 20-year-old years, right? Music plays a huge role. I know, I see my students with their AirPods in all the time. And because that early time in your life is so impactful, the events that happen for many people are the turning points or the most vivid memories. And so when I imagine Plato being just a couple years older than you guys, I really think to myself, wow, this was a critical moment that would stay in his head for the rest of his life. Along with that, very clearly, is the fact that Plato is not just an outside observer, he is a pupil. Now, many of you will say, okay, so that means he has a historical bias. And my answer to that is yes, of course he's biased, but more than that, Plato fully subscribes to a Socratic vision of the world, in as much as we can say that it belongs to Socrates and not to Plato. And he is going to be interpreting most of the events that happened to Socrates through this lens. The trial of Socrates will in some ways be proof to Plato that democracy really is mob rule and that uneducated people make bad decisions. And then the last bullet point, I don't have much to say about this, but just to bring to your attention, the Apology and the Republic are two texts we're going to be looking at today. I want you to notice their dates. The trial of Socrates is 399. The Apology is written almost 10 years later, and the Republic is written about 25 years later. So it's not that Plato sat down immediately after the trial and wrote down a transcript fresh from memory. Rather, he had years to deliberate on these events and came to write them as he had achieved adulthood and some critical distance. So we always have to take those factors into account. All right, about enough of contextualizing here. Let's go ahead and press on to reminding ourselves how it is that Socrates becomes interested in religion and where mythology is going to fit in. Why does mythology come up at all? We're going to start by returning to a text we've already read in this class, The Republic. Take yourself back a couple of weeks before spring break when I was emphasizing the fact that Socrates had a bit of a thought experiment. In The Republic, which is perhaps Plato's most famous big work, he records a conversation that Socrates has with his brothers, most prominently Adeimantus. And in this dialogue, Socrates and Plato are discussing Callipolis, this thought experiment ideal city in which everyone in their thought experiment gets to start with a complete blank slate, and they get to build from the ground up what they would consider a perfect political environment, right? How do you craft the perfect government such that there's never corruption and everyone does the best job that they are suited for? And if you'll remember when we talked about that, I emphasized that Socrates places a great deal of trust in this notion that he's going to have a government run by guardians. Now, the guardian class, of course, there they are. The guardian class are not the physical protectors of the city. That's the auxiliaries or the soldiers. But the guardian class are the people who are deeply wise. They are unique amongst their peers for their wisdom, for their devotion to justice and virtue. And for that reason, Socrates believes that they are uniquely qualified to be leaders of the city. So this guardian class, a very small minority of the ideal city of Callipolis, are going to take the lead and rule in their capacity as the most wise people. Now, because Socrates is placing so much faith in these guardians, he is super specific, down to the nitty-gritty details about how you train them. Socrates sees guardians as people who have the raw potential to be leaders, right? They are unique in their wisdom and justice. But that doesn't mean that they don't need some sort of guidance or training. And in many of those early books of the Republic, Socrates spends a lot of time thinking about how do you create a perfect educational system such that your guardians grow up to be truly wise and virtuous. Now, Socrates believes that we need to start the education system of guardians from a very young age. I stole these kind of cute little pictures of Renaissance kids. But even younger than that, Socrates actually thinks that the guardians need to be regulated from the time that they're born, right? When they're in the nursery and they're just infants. And little, by staggering their education and what they're exposed to, Socrates believes he can create an education system that by the time the guardians are mature adults, they will be fully fledged sort of wise philosopher kings in which to rule the city. So I have in this little blurb here, Socrates says, we have to make sure to take control of their education from a really early period. Guardians cannot be corrupted by immoral examples or stories. I don't know, did you ever have a friend growing up whose parents were really strict and mandated their bedtime and wouldn't let them watch certain television shows? That's kind of how I think, that's the sort of parent I think Socrates would be. With these guardians, he's really obsessed with making sure to contain what it is that they learn and are exposed to, because he doesn't want their souls to be corrupted by outside influences. All right, so we've got that down. Here we are in the Republic. We're creating this ideal city. We're imagining the ideal rulers to be these guardians. And furthermore, Socrates is imagining an ideal education system in which to produce the best possible people. I now want to show you a couple of passages from the Plato's Republic. I'm going to read them out loud and I'm going to dissect them a little bit. And I want to encourage you, if you're planning to write on Socrates, to use these sources yourself. I will say, though, that as with all things Plato, there isn't necessarily just one meaning, right? You really have to read between the lines, because if there's one thing Plato wants from you, he wants to teach you to think critically for yourself. So I'm going to share with you some of the things that jump out to me in these passages, but don't necessarily assume that my interpretation is the only interpretation or the right interpretation. All right, you ready to dig into some Plato translation? Awesome, let's do it. Okay, here we go. All right, this I'm going to zoom in on here. This passage I'm about to share with you is a really famous passage from Book 2 of the Republic. And in it, we find our first evidence for how Socrates even gets to the idea or the topic of censoring Greek mythology. And I'm going to go ahead and read this. And if I remember correctly, the very opening line is Socrates. And I think here he's talking back and forth with Adeimantus. Okay, here we go. What ought to be blamed first and foremost, I said, especially if the lie a man tells isn't a fine one. There's Socrates right there. What's that? When a man in speech makes a bad representation of what gods and heroes are like, just like a painter who paints something that doesn't resemble the things whose likeness he wished to paint. Yes, it's right to blame such things, he, Plato's brother, said. But how do we mean this? And what sort of thing is it? First, I, Socrates, said, the man who told the biggest lie about the biggest things didn't tell a fine lie. How Uranus did what Hesiod says he did, and how Cronus in his turn took revenge on him. And Cronus's deeds and his suffering at the hands of his son, not even if they were true, would I suppose that they should so easily be told to be thoughtless young things. Best would be to keep quiet, but if there were some necessity to tell, as few as possible ought to hear them as unspeakable secrets. Okay, there's a lot in this passage, and I want to sort of break down some of the denser parts. In the opening line, Socrates is beginning to think about what would be the most damaging thing for young people, right? What ought to be blamed first and foremost, right? What is the number one thing we don't want our children to be exposed to? Well, the number one thing for Socrates is if people tell lies that are bad, right? Lies that are not fine. And then he goes on to say, well, if a person tells a bad story about gods and heroes, it's kind of like a painter who is a bad painter, right? Who paints a painting that doesn't look anything like what the object itself is. Clearly, Socrates would not have been a fan of abstract art. I can hear a few of you abstract art fans screaming. And then he goes on to give an example. This is the very last paragraph. He says, what kind of things am I talking about? What kinds of stories about the gods are bad? Stories like the story of Uranus according to Hesiod. Now, I don't expect you to know that myth, but I'm going to share it with you in just a second. Just make sure you're on the same page with me here, right? That Socrates is saying the worst thing for our kids would be to tell them bad stories about the gods that don't really match up with what the gods are like. Okay, you got that down? Now let me tell you the myth that he's referring to here, the myth of Uranus and Cronus. Yes, by the way, indulge your 5th grade humor about Uranus, but in Greek it's actually Uranos. All right, so what's the myth of Uranus and Cronus? So once upon a time in Greek mythology, according to the poet Hesiod, the world had just 2 major gods, the sky god Uranus, or Uranos in Greek, and Mother Earth Gaia. I love this illustration. It's from one of my favorite mythology kids books. Anyway, when these 2 gods were the only gods in the world, they were husband and wife, and they made love nightly, right? Every time Uranos, the night sky, arose, he would look down on Gaia and fall so in love with her beauty, he couldn't but make love to her. Now, their first group of children were called the Titans, and if you're a fan of like the Disney series Hercules, then you know all about the Titans, or there was another Titans movie. I can't maybe remember the Titans. No, I think that's a football movie. Anyway, no more tangents. The first group of children they had anyway were pretty impressive, right? They were beautiful specimens, strong, powerful Titans. But when they had their second and third groups of children, shit started getting really weird. So the second group of children were called the 100-handers, right? They were these weird humanoid anthropomorphic forms, but they had hundreds of hands and arms attached to their body. And the third litter were also monstrous. They were cyclopses and other weird hybrid monster human forms. Now, Mother Earth Gaia knew that these children she had just born were monstrous, but she loved them anyway, right? Just like a mother's love. But Uranus was so horrified by these children that he grabbed them up in his sky arm and he punched them deep, deep into the earth. He buried them in the deepest, darkest craters of the earth, essentially putting them deep into Gaia's body. And this was so painful and so offensive to her that she refused to have sex with Uranos anymore. And furthermore, she asked her leading son, the Titan Kronos, to make sure that Uranos could never have sex with her again. And so that's this weird little painting I've got for you on the right-hand side. The Titan Kronos used a sickle scythe, a farming tool, to castrate his father, to cut off his genitalia, so that Uranos would never be able to have sex with Gaia again or ever produce children once more. Now, if this seems like a pretty dark, weird, and disgusting myth to you, then you're absolutely right. It is really dark, weird, and disgusting. And you can see exactly why Socrates didn't want kids to hear it. It teaches so many bad examples, right? On the one hand, it starts as a love story, but then it talks about a father, banishing his own children. And then it also talks about a wife betraying her husband and using her son to do violence to her husband. There are so many bad examples in here. And so to zoom back to the point that Socrates is trying to make, he says, we need to keep these sorts of myths quiet. And if we do have to tell it, we're going to try to keep it as quiet as possible and only keep it in the hands of just a few, right? This isn't a story that poets or priests should be telling widespread, right? We don't want bad or dark myths to be circulating amongst our children. All right, let me pause there. You feel like you've got it? If you don't, write some comments in the YouTube video. I'll be happy to try to answer them. So that's one example, the example of Uranus and Cronus. I now want to switch gears to a second passage in the Republic to give you another example of what Socrates cites as an example of a bad myth. So just like last time, I'm going to read this myth aloud. I'm going to try to clarify a few points within it, and then I'll show you some fun pictures. Okay, so this myth, the myth of Hera's bindings by her son, about Hephaestus being cast out by his father, when he was about to help his mother who was being beaten, and all the battles of the gods Homer made must not be accepted in the city, whether they are made with a hidden sense or without a hidden sense. A young thing can't judge what is hidden sense and what is not. But what he takes into his opinions at that age has a tendency to become hard to eradicate and unchangeable. Perhaps it's for this reason that we must do everything to ensure that what they hear first with respect to virtue be the finest told tales for them to hear. Okay, so let's rewind just a little bit. So you know already that in this second example, Socrates is referring to a myth about Hephaestus and Hera, which I'll share with you in a minute. But I first want to draw your attention to this line in the middle of the passage where he says, we can't accept these myths into our city, whether they are made with a hidden sense or without a hidden sense. What Socrates here is talking about an allegory, right? An allegory is, are the myths metaphorical? Socrates is saying it doesn't matter if this myth is just a metaphor for something else. Young people can't tell the difference between metaphors and non-metaphors. You guys are probably a little too young for the rise of the rapper Eminem, but I remember when I was in middle school and high school, Eminem was just becoming really popular, and his albums were just panned by U.S. senators and congresspeople everywhere because Eminem's early albums had so much violence in them, descriptions of killing girlfriends or beating lovers or, even murdering his mother. And all of the U.S. Congress people and senators who hated Eminem would get up there on the news and say, young people can't tell the difference if he's just joking or if he's speaking metaphorically. If they hear this music, they're going to do bad things just like his lyrics are about. And what Socrates is saying is essentially the same thing, right? Young people can't judge what is just metaphorical and what isn't. Maybe some of you guys also had parents who didn't like violent video games, and they would say something similar, right? Kids can't tell the difference between a shoot 'em up game versus reality. Now, let's zoom in a little bit on what is this myth exactly that Socrates is talking about. Well, you may know if you, these are all figures I stole from the Disney show. Zeus and Hera, of course, are wife and husband. They are the couple that rules over all of the Olympic gods. And they have a handful of biological children of their own, one of whom is Hephaestus. Hephaestus is the god of the forge. My husband, the blacksmith, has like a huge tattoo of Hephaestus on his arm. And in the Disney version, it makes it seem like Hera and Zeus have a really happy marriage, that they're loving, that they're monogamous. But in Greek mythology, their relationship is actually really tumultuous. Half the time they're having sex, and half the time they're beating the hell out of each other. And let me give you a little bit of a trigger warning if this is troubling for you here. But Zeus is described in many myths of actually physically abusing Hera, of beating her, of locking her up, of threatening to sort of bury her. I'm not sure you can kill an Olympic god. And she expresses terror in many myths about what Zeus could do to her if he catches her. So in this particular myth that Socrates is referring to, he mentions that, Zeus is beating Hera. And in one version of the myth, Hephaestus, her son, steps in to try to protect her. And Zeus grabs the child Hephaestus by the legs or the arms, like you see in this little relief here, and he hurls him to the ends of the earth. Purportedly in the myth, Hephaestus circles for days and days in the air. That's how powerfully Zeus throws him. You can just kind of imagine him in orbit, until finally he falls back to earth. His legs' bones are shattered, and it's for this reason that Hephaestus is crippled until the end of his days. He is a very good blacksmith, but he's often shown in either being a wheelchair or kind of a hunched over position because his father threw him and he was permanently damaged because of that. So in this myth, again, Socrates is saying, these are not good stories. We should not be telling our children myths about men beating women, about Hephaestus being cast out. And even if this myth is just meant to be a metaphor for something else, then that's not enough to tell it because, again, young people can't tell the difference. All right, I'm going to wrap up this section of the lecture on why Socrates challenges myths, but I also want to give you a little bit more ammo to go explore on your own. Some of the other things that Socrates thinks we should ban in the Republic, I've picked out just a couple of sections on the gods. He doesn't really think that we should teach children any myths about gods causing bad things. As he says here, the god, since he's good, wouldn't be the cause of everything, but the cause of a few things for human beings, right? And that no one should say that gods cause or do bad things. There should be no myths, I'm now on the kind of second passage, there should be no myths about gods changing physical form. If you were a god, why would you want to be any physical form other than your godlike form? So we shouldn't tell any myths about people like Zeus or Hera taking the form of a human being and coming down to earth. Socrates also wants to ban any myths about gods tricking human beings. We shouldn't say that he changes himself or deceives others by illusions or speeches. And lastly, and perhaps most controversially, Socrates doesn't want any myths about the underworld being a bad place. What about this? Do you suppose anyone who believes Hades' domain exists and is full of terror will be fearless in the face of death and choose death in battles above defeat and slavery? In this instance, Socrates is actually being very pragmatic. He's afraid that if we teach children that death is bad and scary and gloomy, that our guardians, when they're all grown up, will be afraid to die for the city. And that if they're afraid of death, they're going to try to put their own lives and the lives of their loved ones above what is good for the city. And so in order to create truly perfect guardians, we need to lie to them about the underworld. We need to tell them that death is not scary, or that it's at least a neutral place. So to wrap up this section of my lecture, this is really evidence point number 1 for you to dig into, which is the question of that Socrates seems to be censoring or questioning the value of some established myths. Is it because he thinks they're untrue? He never really comes out and says that they're not true. He just says that they're not good for people. And that's an important distinction for you to keep in mind. All right, I'm going to pause here, just give you a couple seconds to jot down any notes. We're going to move to argument number 2 in just a second. All right, time for argument number 2. Okay, Let me zoom myself back out. I always have to remember to look into the camera and not down. Otherwise, I look like I'm fussing with notes. Okay, here we go. Point number 2. All right, if evidence point number 1 is that in the Republic, Socrates seems to be challenging certain myths as being bad for people, evidence point number 2 has to do with how Socrates describes his own personal religious beliefs. And in another text of Plato we're going to look at in just a second, we see that Socrates describes himself following his own god, a god that he calls his daimonion. Now, this is remarkable because, of course, I've been arguing here that Socrates challenges religion, that he privileges wisdom above all other virtues, but Socrates is not shy about sharing his own religious beliefs. Okay, got some tea. Now, let me start with the basic question of what is a daimonion? Pardon me. A daimonion is a term that is well known in Greek literature. Socrates didn't invent it. And it also, daimonion is just, it's called a diminutive, meaning it's like a daimonion is a little daimon. A daimon looks like the word demon, and that's not an accident. In the Greek language before Christianity, a daimon is like a benevolent guardian spirit who hovers around individuals. There is some suggestion in early Greek literature that the Greeks believed that a daimon was the soul of a great hero or a figure from the Golden Age who came back to Earth in order to guide human beings in the present day. When I think of daimons a little bit, maybe these references will mean something to you, maybe they won't. If you've ever played the Zelda series, Ocarina of Time, you know that Link, the character, has this little hovering fairy named Navi, and that she guides him and talks to him and gives him advice. I think that's as good an approximation of what a daimon is as anything else. Or maybe as a kid, at some point you encountered either the book or the movie called The Golden Compass. This book is actually very Platonic, and it adopts this fictional idea that in a parallel universe, human beings have their souls living outside their body in an animal form, who is their daimon. And again, that animal is kind of a guide and a guardian for the human being. How did a daimon come to mean an evil spirit like a demon? Well, as always, it has to do with Christianity. In the rise of Christianity, Christians wanted to discredit most pagan religion, and so eventually the term daimon came to be used to mean an evil spirit, a non-Christian entity that would be bad for human beings to encounter. So we're now going to dive into a couple passages where Socrates talks about his daimon, and as we do that, you're going to notice that we're switching texts. So the last couple passages I had you read were from the Republic, but this couple descriptions of Socrates' daimon come from a different text called the Apology. Now, the Apology is also written by Plato, and sometimes when students read it, they get a little bit confused by the title, because in English, an apology means an admission of wrongdoing, right? I did something wrong, I'm going to give you an apology. Or we really judge celebrities when they give public apologies. We judge their wording, right? Did they say, I'm sorry that other people were angry, or do they actually take responsibility? But in Greek, an apology does not mean an admission of wrongdoing. It actually means the opposite. It's a defense. An apologia is a speech, a counter speech, a counter argument. So Plato's Apology is a record of what he claims that Socrates said in his trial to his prosecutors in order to argue against the two charges that he was impious and that he was corrupting the youth. So in this first passage we're going to look at in just a minute, I want to zoom in on a couple places where Socrates describes what his daimonion is and why it's been helpful or meaningful to him. All right, so let's start with this passage from the Apology. And all of these two passages are both Socrates speaking. I'll go ahead and read them. Perhaps then it might seem to be strange that I do not go around counseling these things and being a busybody in private. but that in public I do not dare to go up before your multitude to counsel the city. The cause of this is what you have heard me speak of many times and in many places, that something divine and daimonic comes to me, a voice which, of course, is also what Meletus wrote about in the indictment, making a comedy over it. Now, in this passage, Socrates is trying to explain why he does philosophy, but why he also doesn't want to be a politician, right? He's saying in the beginning of this passage, maybe you think it's strange that I just don't keep to myself, that I don't just practice my philosophy privately, but also that I don't go up in the assembly and try to give political speeches. And the reason he says why he walks this tightrope between a public and a private life is because of the voice inside of him, the daimonion who guides him. And in the second passage, he says, this is something which began for me in childhood, a sort of voice that comes. And whenever it does, it always turns me away from whatever I am about to do, but it never turns me forward. This is what opposes my political activity, and its opposition seems to me altogether noble. For know well, men of Athens, if long ago I attempted to be politically active, I would long ago have perished, and I would have benefited neither you nor myself. So for Socrates, this daimonion is a voice that he's been hearing since childhood, and he emphasizes the daimonion never tells him what to do, but it's like a little alarm bell that goes off when he's about to do something wrong. So Socrates says, I thought about getting involved in politics, but my daimonion went off telling me, don't do this, don't get invested, otherwise you will come to some sort of downfall. Maybe like the generals of Arginusae, or maybe like Alcibiades. Remember, Socrates was living through a time of real political turmoil, and maybe it made sense to him not to get involved in politics. But if Socrates says that on the one hand, his daimonion tells him not to get involved in public politics, Socrates also thinks it's really important that his daimon is proof that Socrates does in fact believe in religion in some capacity. And in the next passage I want to share with you, he's arguing back and forth with Meletus, and he says, I'm not impious. I believe in the gods. I just believe in my God, right? So here's this passage right here. Socrates, therefore, if I do believe in daimons, as you say, and if on the one hand daimons are gods of some sort, then this would be what I say you are riddling and jesting about when you say that I don't believe in gods, and again that I do believe in gods since I do believe in daimons. But Meletus, there is no way that you did not bring this indictment either to test us in these things, or else because you were at a loss about what true injustice you might charge me in. There is no device by which you could persuade any human being who is even slightly intelligent that it is not the part of the same man to believe in both daimonia and divine things, and further that the same man believes in neither daimons nor gods and heroes. So there's a lot in this passage, but essentially Socrates is catching his prosecutor Meletus in a little bit of a logic trap. He's saying, so wait a minute. You say that I believe in daimons, and I agree. I've just told you I listen to my personal daimon. It guides me in life. But you're also saying that I don't believe in gods. So like, which is it? You can't have both. Either I believe in my daimons and I follow their divine advice, or I don't believe in daimons and I don't believe in gods. So Socrates is really playing Meletus here, and you can tell he's using logic and argumentation to put Meletus in an either-or category, right? Which is pretty darn clever. So in this passage, what we've really illuminated is that Socrates seems to be challenging state religion, like the mythology of the gods, the worship of the gods, at least the worship of their myths that show them doing bad things. But he isn't disavowing religion entirely. He is saying there is a place for religion. I listen to it whenever I need to make a major decision about my life or my politics. So for you guys, we're not going to move away from this first charge on impiety. You're really going to have to ask yourself a couple of questions. Based on those passages, based on those pieces of evidence, do you think that Socrates is guilty of charge number 1? Is his questioning of mythology, is his challenging of the stories of the gods equal to not believing in gods? Is it equal to teaching other people not to believe in gods? Is Socrates starting an anti-religion movement because he's calling these myths into question? And is it acceptable in Athens for people to follow their own gods if they think that the state gods are bad examples? Now, you could argue this either way. I think you could very easily make the argument that Socrates is picking and choosing which myths he wants to believe in. And that's not how religion works. I don't get to go through the Bible or the Quran and say, this bit is true, this bit is not true. So maybe Socrates is in fact being impious. But I also think you could make the case that this whole Republic conversation is a thought experiment. Socrates isn't necessarily giving people exact advice about here's what you should and shouldn't believe. He's sort of raising these idea bubbles about, well, if we had to raise children, what sorts of myths would we want to insulate them from? All right, I want to transition now a little bit briefly to the second charge. I promise I've only got about somewhere between 5 to 8 minutes left to go, because I want to touch on this concern about, is Socrates corrupting the youth, right? That really takes us to charge number 2, and particularly the concept of the sophists. And is Socrates a sophist? Charge number 2 against Socrates is corruption. He corrupts the youth. That's not very easy to pin down, but it might help if you understood a little bit about Athenian intellectual context, which is that in Socrates and Plato's generation, Athens saw a big influx of these new group of teachers called the sophists. Now, the word sophist comes from the Greek word sophos, which means wise. And so the sophists were basically teachers who offered to give wisdom to other Greeks. I've had a little fun with this picture of the sophists by giving them some cool aviator shades and a little sophists for hire sign, because sophists were incredibly popular among rich young Athenian men. Why? Well, probably for the reason that many teachers are just popular, that they seem very authoritative. And furthermore, they taught young men how to do the kind of tricky argumentation that Socrates was doing with his accuser Meletus, where he's sort of picking apart ideas and arguments. He's challenging people to be precise in their language. Now, the vast majority of sophists, in order to study with them, it was a substantial investment of money. And in fact, we know the names of many of Athens's most prominent sophists. I'm actually going to come back to the slide in a second. Let me zoom down here. Yeah, some of the most prominent sophists of ancient Athens were a few guys named Gorgias. We have a follower of Gorgias in our class, section number 1, that's Jana. We also know of another sophist named Prodicus, who was very expensive, and yet another one named Hippias. And all of these guys competed with each other to be the best teacher of Athens and to garner the favor of the most popular students. Now, what did these sophists sort of do on a daily basis? They would gather in the agora. If they were rich, they would set up their own school. They might rent out a building and allow young men to congregate there. But a lot of what they did was just to go out in public spaces where young men spent time, into the marketplace, into the bathhouses, into the gymnasiums, around the temples. And they would gather these young men to themselves and offer to teach them for a very high fee. Now, if you think this is a weird way for young men to be spending their time, I really want to remind you that in many ways, when I think of the sophists, I think of debate culture. And I don't know about your high school, but many high schools in the country have very popular high school debate teams. It's in college too, a college debate team. And people in these debate teams will spend hours and hours preparing arguments. There's even a really crazy movement. I'm going to share the link in this YouTube title description of the fast speed debaters. I can't even imitate them, but they give these speeches that are incredibly fast, like they make these arguments dense with economic facts and historical facts and government policy, because the more arguments you pack in to a really fast speech, the more points you get from the judges. So lest you think that the sophists was like a weird blip when people wanted to practice public speaking, it's a little bit analogous, like I said, to public speaking events and speech and debate teams that you see in high schools and colleges all over the country. But what's really important here is that Socrates wants people to know that he is not one of these sophists. He really tries to put some distance between himself and the sophists and say, I don't charge for my teaching, and I'm not trying to teach people speech skills. What I do is philosophy and deep critical thinking skills, right? That's the kind of instruction that I offer. So I want to jump down now to to a passage from the Apology in which Socrates intentionally calls out the sophists. And he also points out that there's all kind of rich Athenians who pay these guys. But again, that Socrates says, I'm not one of them. Here's a passage in the Apology. None of these things is so. If you have heard from anyone that I attempt to educate human beings and make money from it, that's not true either. Though this too seems to me to be noble, if one should be able to educate human beings like Gorgias or Prodicus or Hippias, for each of them men is able, going into each of the cities, to persuade the young, who can associate with whomever of their own citizens they wish to for free. They persuade these young men to leave off their associations with the latter and to associate with themselves instead, and to give them money and acknowledge gratitude. So Socrates is really kind of making 2 points in this passage. He's saying that in our city-state in Athens, people are free to spend time with whoever they want to. But for some reason, many young men in Athens are willing to pay a ton of money to study with one of these guys, Gorgias or Prodicus or Hippias. And so if they want to do that, I think that's great, but that's actually not what I offer. I am not one of these sophists who's charging high fees to train the young. And in another passage from the Apology I want to look at, Socrates actually calls out Callias. In section number 1, Callias was played by Walter, and in O2 it was played by Toby. And he actually he remembers a conversation he had with Callias, and Callias is talking about how he educates his sons and just how much money it costs for them to spend time with sophists. So here's again another passage in the Apology, 20b. Callias, I said, this is Socrates speaking, if your 2 sons had been born colts or calves, we would have been able to get and hire an overseer for them who could make the 2 of them noble and good. And he would have been someone from among those skilled with horses and skilled in farming. But as it is, since they're 2 human beings, whom do you have in mind to get as an overseer for the 2 of them? Who is knowledgeable in such virtue, that of a human being and of a citizen? For I suppose you have considered it since you have sons. Is there someone or not? So here Socrates is saying, look, if you had 2 pet dogs or 2 pet horses or cattle, you would hire someone to train them, but you have children. So who have you chosen to raise your children? And here's Callias's response on the bottom. Quite so, he said. Who, I said, and where is he from, and how much does he teach? Evenus, Callias said, from Paros, 5 minae. And I regarded Evenus as blessed if he should truly have this art and teaches at such a modest rate, right? So we know that Callias is paying to have his sons educated by Paro, from Evenus of Paros, paying 5 minae, which if I remember correct is about $100,000. And that's regarded as a bargain, right? Socrates is pointing out, boy, you can hire someone for $100,000 to teach your kids virtue? Yahtzee, like that must be a real deal. Now, why is Socrates pointing out all these examples of other teachers who teach for money? The reason is that Socrates believes that if he can show the Athenians that he's not a teacher, that he's not actually charging anything for his ideas, that he can get off the charge of corruption of the youth. Because if Socrates isn't an official teacher, and if he's not taking any money for his ideas, then he can say, look, yes, it's true that your sons hang out with me. And yes, it's true that some of them have maybe been influenced by me. But that doesn't mean that I'm corrupting them, right? They are young adults. They are making their own decisions. And I can't be found guilty of corruption if I'm just a free spouter of ideas and some people get attached to them, right? That doesn't make me a corrupter of the youth. So I want to end here with my final slide and point out that for me, the really big takeaway when I look at passages from the Republic and the Apology is that Socrates could simply have just blanket denied all of the charges. But in Plato, he's really doing a deep dive into what does it mean to be religious and what does it mean to be a teacher. Those two categories is not as simple as saying, I have red hair or I have brown hair. Being a teacher and being religious are very complex concepts. And Socrates is pushing people, and Plato is pushing his readers to define for themselves what does it mean to be pious and what does it mean to be virtuous. All right, I hope this was helpful. I'm going to include a PDF of the Republic so that you can go hunt down these passages on your own. I'll upload these slides to Blackboard so you can follow along as you like. And I'll also include an adorable little link to crazy speed debaters from high school who just enunciate words at a rate I can't even imagine. Have a good Wednesday, guys.